Hello to everybody. I hope you all are as well as can be expected under the circumstances. And welcome to this TPI panel on data portability and interoperability for tech platforms, costs and benefits. Requiring data portability, being able to easily move one's personal data to a competing platform, perhaps together with the related requirement of interoperability, has become a rare point of widespread agreement. The European Union's data protection, general data protection regulation includes a right to data portability, and Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerman even included it in his internet regulation proposal that was published a few months ago in the Washington Post. Portability, along with interoperability, is a central requirement of the Access Act introduced by Senators Warner, Hawley, and Blumenthal. And finally, 3 major reports on digital platform competition issues published in 2019 by the European Commission, the United Kingdom Digital Competition Expert Panel, and the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, all endorsed the data portability requirement as well as some form of interoperability. Advocates argue that portability and interoperability would encourage entry and competition with incumbent tech platforms while also providing privacy benefits. And this panel, we have a really great panel to discuss this, the validity of these claims and the costs and benefits of portability and interoperability requirements. I will briefly introduce the panelists and then we'll get on with the discussion. Jason Furman is a professor of the practice of economic policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he chaired the UK Digital Competition Expert Panel, which issued a widely cited report last year, which is often referred to as the Furman Report. Michael Katz is professor emeritus at the Haas School of Business in the Department of Economics and the Sarin Chair in Strategy and Leadership at UC Berkeley. He's a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economic Analysis at the Antitrust Division. Bijan Madhani is the Privacy and Public Policy Manager at Facebook. And Catherine Tucker is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management Science at MIT Sloan. Let me start by discussing what we mean by data portability as it applies to tech platforms. Jason, your report endorses a data portability requirement. How is it defined there?
Yeah, so thank you so much for organizing this this discussion. And we called in our report, just to sort of step back and give the overall context, for injecting more competition into the digital space. We didn't presume the size of companies or the number of companies. This wasn't a proposal to break companies up. To some degree, it dealt with the inflow into competition, which is rules about mergers. But that's not enough when you already have many big incumbents already. Just changing some merger rules isn't going to change a lot. So we proposed also a set of pro-competitive regulatory steps to be taken by Digital Markets Unit. Was thrilled that in March, as part of its budget, the UK government formally endorsed all of the strategic recommendations of the panel that I chaired made. And the Digital Markets Unit would be responsible for 3 things. One is we called it data mobility and systems with open standards, portability and interoperability. The second was a code of conduct, and the third was data openness. In terms of the first, our view was we could not in our report spell out, here are the things that have to be mobile, here's how the APIs have to work, here's how it has to protect your privacy and security. Nor could the government write a rule that says you must just do this across the board. This wasn't some simple template or self-executing statement. That's why it was assigned as a responsibility to a digital markets unit. The idea was we looked at open banking in the UK in part as a model. And with open banking, there was an implementation entity. And that implementation entity had a robust budget, a robust set of staffing, excellent leadership, and had to really roll up its sleeves and work through exactly how this would work, what it would mean in different applications. We're probably going to hear about the great work that Facebook and others have been doing with the digital transfer project. And I certainly think that is great work. I think maybe that's partly motivated by belief that regulation of some form is coming and trying to get ahead of it, partly motivated by what consumers want. But I don't think the incentives of companies are fully aligned with the incentives of consumer welfare on a question like this, which is why I think some of it needs to be forced to happen and needs something to help do that forcing and guide it forward.
Well, maybe we'll get into some of the details of what people mean by data portability a little later, because a lot of interesting things are kind of in the detail. There are lots of different types of data that could be required to be ported, and what sort of timetable is the UK, this new entity in the UK, on in terms of promulgating regulations or moving this forward?
So they formally announced in mid-May as part of their budget that they accepted the strategic recommendations and tasked the CMA with figuring out some of the details about how to do all of this. So it a little bit bounced from us to the government. The CMA had a report as part of all of this, and then has bounced back from the government. The timetable obviously was affected by Brexit, is I presume affected by what's going on now. I've continued to advise the government, but I confess in the last 2 months, this is literally the first thing I've done that is not related directly to COVID. I think it's a rather nice break in all of the COVID related, but yeah, I can't speak to what's happened in the last 2 months, but I think they're ahead of most everyone else in the world in the UK is, and I think setting what I think could be a good model for other countries to follow.
So, but I'm going to get to the Facebook project in a minute, but let me just a couple more questions. I mean, in your report, I'm not, is it too strong to say that you put forth the view that data portability and perhaps interoperability were kind of necessary to have competition in the digital platform space?
Yeah, facilitate people multi-homing, facilitate people switching, and the threat of both of those is critical. Yeah.
Okay.
And this gets to sort of the question around network externalities and the like, that some of that's natural. If you're talking about a sewer system, you don't want to have 2 pipes to everyone's house. And that's a physical reality that you can't change with any given regulation. You have to regulate the price of that or have the government own it. In this case, there's some natural monopoly things like that. You all want to be on the same social network. But some of that is also a function of whether you have open standards or not. So email is not subject to those types of natural monopoly network effects because our emails can interoperate. And so part of what we were trying to get at is you can't just simply say you have network externalities and so it's great and efficient to have it at scale. You have to give a shot at interoperability, facilitate entry, multi-homing and the like.
So Bijan, what does Facebook mean by data portability?
That's a good question. I think we we mean a few different things. And I think that's because the regulatory space is so undefined. You know, from the product perspective, we really mean the ability for users to take their data from Facebook and move it to another service. I think Mark says this best in his op-ed on internet regulation from March of last year, where he says, if you share data with one service, you should be able to share it with any other from that service. And I think that's what we're trying to effectuate on the product side. We've been offering a couple of different variations on data portability for the better part of 10 years now. You know, I think I like to map these to the GDPR's two prongs on data portability. The first is the ability to request your data from a service, and we've offered the ability download your information now since 2010, and that enables users to pick which data types over a date range, over quality, choose the quality of that data, and download it in HTML or a machine readable JSON format. And then we've also offered, now starting since December of last year, the first public facing product built on the data transfer project, which enables our users to move photos and videos directly from Facebook first to Google Photos. We anticipate including additional data types and additional destinations as we, gain sort of technical facility with how the data transfer project works in practice and at scale. But it's really just for us, takes those two forms, the downloadable form and the direct transfer form. And the data transfer project is really just exciting because it is an open source collaboration initiated by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and most recently joined by Apple, that is designed to basically take some of the sort of technical engineering burden out of putting together some of these, direct transfer tools between companies on a couple of different levels. The first is that, Facebook and the other companies have the engineering resources to devote to trying these tools out. They're complicated to build. They have to work in various different cloud hosting environments. It has to work in Microsoft Azure, it has to work in AWS, it has to work in proprietary services. And that takes a lot of complexity to build out. And so, part of the attractiveness of the data transfer project as an open source project is that we can do the heavy lifting on the front end for smaller companies. The second thing is addressing the challenge of sort of different data structures. And this is sometimes called an interoperability problem, but it's really about sort of consistency between data models. Facebook describes photos, describes events, describes messaging in a particular way in our data structure. Google does that in their own way. GroupMe does that in its own way. Any number of different services will describe photos and videos in some basic level, and then have additional information that is encoded in their data structure that may be proprietary to them or specific to how they use that particular data type, which makes it challenging for data to go from Facebook's environment, cloud environment or server environment to Microsoft's, or from Microsoft's to GroupMe's, or from GroupMe's to some other companies. And so what we're trying to do as part of the data transfer project is solve this, which in computer programming parlance is an n-squared problem, where everyone has to build a specific pipe from Facebook to Google and from Google to Microsoft for every particular data type, and make it an n problem for every data type. So essentially you need to only have the number of a single data model for every single data type. So in this instance, for photos, we describe photos in a fairly common way. We use existing file formats, so JPEG, GIF, PNG, and then we include in the data model the most common things you'd need for transferring photos between services. And if any additional stuff, tags on Facebook or albums as they're structured on Google, can be included on a bilateral basis, or it can just be included at each platform. You don't have to include all the additional bells and whistles if you don't want to. And so we basically try to reach the most usable common denominator of features to enable transferring of a particular data type. And so, we're really excited to see the product develop. We're hoping to see, additional uptake of the data transfer project open source code by smaller companies. We're actively recruiting. If there are small companies on the call today, we encourage your policy teams to reach out to us, your engineering teams to reach out to our engineers. There's a public Slack channel. Everyone should really try to take part in the data transfer project.
Do you publish the number of people who've transferred their photos from Facebook to Google, or?
So the tool is fairly new. We don't have public numbers available just yet, but I can tell you that we're pretty excited by the uptake, and as we expand, from our initial launch in Ireland to the full European Union, where there is a lot of facility in the user base with the general data protection regulation and more in a fairly good understanding of the right to data portability, to places like the US, where there is simply just interest in data protection rights, but perhaps less understanding of the right to data portability. We're seeing more and more interest, and the more and more awareness people have of these rights and of the availability of the tool, the more uptake we're seeing.
So so you're introducing this, I assume, because you think it's a good service for your customers,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps not for the same reason that it's included in reports like Jason's and the other reports, that you think there's a fundamental competition problem in the digital sector?
No, I think that's certainly where a lot of the external pressure is coming from in to do something on data portability in the policy space. But I think in the product space, we've offered this since 2010. There was no regulatory imperative to do it. It was just something that was usable for people. And that's sort of what's driven our development of the data transfer project over the last 18 months or so. It's really been focused on what data types are most valuable to people. When you use Facebook, especially in your earlier days on Facebook, photos were the sort of killer app on Facebook. And as a result, that's sort of the initial version of the product that we built. Of course, we also care about compliance with the law. So GDPR, CCPA, the upcoming LGPD in Brazil, they all include rights to data portability in some form or fashion. They're similar. And so, we're also endeavoring to make sure that our tools meet the expectations of regulators around the world. But those are really privacy regulators. The GDPR, LGPD are enforced by DPAs, or will be enforced by DPAs in the Brazilian case. And the CCPA is enforced by the Attorney General there. And so our goal here is responsive to user needs and really data protection authority needs in the sort of first instance, and then to these sort of additional pressures about the ecosystem and innovation in the second instance.
Let me turn now to Catherine and Michael, and ask for your comments on kind of the base question about whether you think there's a competition problem in the digital sectors, and whether data portability / interoperability requirements are necessary to make the sector more competitive. Let me start with Catherine and Michael.
Right. No, so what I always think about this kind of debate and discussion is that it's really useful to have an articulation of what exactly are the switching costs we're worried about, and what is it that we're trying to solve. So I think sometimes, data portability is a huge issue, and interoperability is a huge issue. So for example, I've studied the transfer of data in the healthcare sector and hospital systems' reluctance to share data of medical images with other hospitals. And there you have a really clear switching cost, right? Because if I ever had an MRI done in one hospital, I'm really not going to want to have another MRI done in another hospital just because they won't transfer that image. So that's a really good example of switching costs in an area where I think, regulators should be focused and think about intervention. Simply with the wonderful open banking initiative that Jason mentioned, there we have huge switching costs to do with data, in that transferring, in the UK, everyone has all these sort of ACH payments, direct debits set up. It's a huge hassle, almost a nightmare to try and change bank accounts because of these, and we're solving that switching cost. I'm still, I think what Bijan's doing is utterly wonderful. And it's great we're sort of reducing the switching cost, but I'm not sure if it's the biggest switching cost. And so I'm sort of you know, I just think it's wonderful in this debate if we can articulate where that switching cost is coming to. And that means that we can focus on the areas where we're really worried and make sure that actions there happen there, rather than the sort of generalized idea, or there may be switching costs because of data.
Michael?
So actually, let me just step back for a second. It seems to me we're talking probably about at least 3 different sets of issues. They're getting rolled together. And I think, I mean, it's something that Jason's report recognized, and it's why, as he said, they said they weren't going to say which kinds of data and exactly what should be done. So let me just step back on that. So one is there's sort of these issues of switching costs, and I think you can talk about that broadly as 2 kinds even there. It's sort of data the user put in and you don't want to have to re-enter and all this stuff in your identity multiple times, or things where you've built up a history, you know, so as Bijan mentioned, things about photographs, or there may be things so that if you switch, the service would be degraded when you went to the other place because you've lost that stuff. So reducing those kinds of switching costs, I have to say as an economic theorist, it's actually not, as a matter of theory, clear that reducing those switching costs is necessarily good for consumers, but I don't think anybody believes it's not. And I think that's probably good stuff to do. Similarly, as long as the costs of interoperability aren't too high, I think interoperability, which is really different than portability, is a good thing for the reason Jason said, that it allows, well, and maybe he didn't say it this way, is that it just allows to have bigger networks because they're interoperable. I mean, I think everyone agrees the fact that we have global interoperability of telephone networks is a good thing. You can have multiple networks at the same time and you can still get all the benefits of a network. So to the extent that we have technologies that are stable enough that having standards that then allow us to have interoperability for these communication services, I think that's a good thing. Now, but there's another, so those are both about switching costs, but there's another issue that's come up a lot, particularly Microsoft has brought it up, and that is this question about, is there data entry, barrier to entry, and do we need some sort of sharing of data, mandatory sharing of data across platforms to overcome that? And that, I think, is much more controversial, and I think is worth pointing out, is something, at least as I understand the data transfer project, it explicitly exempts data that would fall in that category. And so that it's not trying to solve the problem of the data barrier to entry. So anyway, I think it's just important to separate those things out, because as at least the one document I have from which I'm looking over to read, it says that portability should not extend to data that may negatively impact privacy of users, which is a huge issue we haven't talked about. But when everybody says you can transfer your data, the question,
What's that really mean?
What's your data? And what if you're on a social network, what about other people? But then there's the other aspect of your data, which it addresses. It says, are data collected to improve a service, including data generated to improve system performance or train models. So you also get this thing, and I don't know if this comes up with Facebook or not, but I'll use them as an example. You say, I want to transfer my data, and Facebook, for some things, presumably will say, no, that's not your data, it's another user's. Or Facebook will say, that's not your data, that's our data. And so I think there are huge numbers of issues we're going to have to deal with there. I think everyone recognizes that, as I said, in case of the UK report, I think you explicitly said, we need to wait, somebody else is going to have to really dig into that. But I think that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road, is figuring out what are the boundaries on that. In terms of these first steps of reducing switching costs or trying to make it so that networks at a base level can share messages like email, I think those are good things and it's good we're doing it. Big question is, how much farther do we go?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, are switching costs really, I mean, Catherine mentioned a couple of examples where you thought that switching costs were important, but for, you know, many, I mean, are switching costs important for many of the major platforms like Google and Amazon? And I mean, do you think there's a switching cost problem there?
Well, part of it with me, the problem, do I think that, you know, eliminating switching costs, it's going to suddenly, you know, change the world? No, but the other hand, firms are willing to do it. I think there are clear consumer benefits, and I think there is reason to believe it will, you know, have effect on competition at the margin. So it seems like it's a good thing. I don't think it's a panacea.
Catherine?
Yes, I mean, so I think this is what you know, one of the struggles, right? And I'm going to bring it back to the open banking regulation. the banking is a product where people typically single home. And why? Well, there's just huge switching costs of moving your bank account around. You just want one account. But if you actually look at the data, people multi-home all the time with social, for example, social networks. And yes, they devote very different bundles of time to each of the social networks, but they're multi-homing, which is perhaps suggestive, that it's not, it's not just a matter of whether or not switching costs driving this. Because I think it's good to start with switching costs, then to think, well, do we see multi-homing? And then if we're seeing multi-homing, perhaps saying, not sure about how we should think about switching costs here.
And let me also ask you, Catherine, since you've written on the subject as well, Michael brought up this issue of data as a barrier to entry. Do you think the fact that incumbents have, how serious a barrier to entry do you think data is?
The first thing I'd say is that, look, yes, one of the problems we have is that you get these sort of sexy articles saying, oh, data is about barrier to entry, and data is treated as a homogeneous thing. And what I've always tried to do is just lay out a framework for thinking about when data might actually be problematic. Can we identify instances where data is unique, valuable, non-imitable, all of these different things, which mean really you could start to think of it as an essential facility. And certainly I think, you can identify cases, perhaps, genomic data would be a good example. But what's interesting, this brings it back to what Michael was saying, is that a lot of the times when you do see instances of data actually being potentially a barrier to entry, that has been reinforced by some degree of privacy protection. Because, obviously data is very easy to copy in its digital form. So there has to be something else which buttresses it up as a barrier to entry. And I think Michael's exactly right to point to this big tension between, our desire to have, privacy regulation, robust privacy regulation, also our desire to have, free flows of data between different edge providers, especially young nascent firms.
And let me also ask something that Michael brought up. He kind of, the analogy with data portability and interoperability is often made, to the telephone system, to number portability and interoperability to telephone networks. Is that obviously is that an apt analogy? I mean, these networks that we're talking about, it seems to me to be considerably more complicated than the phone networks.
Is that for anybody or is that for Catherine?
It's for anybody. It's for anybody.
You go ahead. I've talked too long.
Oh, sure. Oh, thank you. So, I think, it's number portability is a great primer for approaching data portability. It's something that everyone's familiar with. It's even less complex than the open banking environment, but it's similar in that the services and products are sort of commoditized, fairly homogeneous. There's really no difference between which bank you use, except for the fact that you started with one. For the most part, in the core services, and that's probably true for the telecom space too. Everyone's offering voice, text, data, with perhaps different coverage maps and prices, but for the most part, you're experiencing the same service across the board. And I think it requires you to have a much simpler, I think, ecosystem to make number portability work than it does to make data portability work. And you have to approach data portability with, I think, a little more intention around what you're trying to do. I think that's sort of what Jason was getting at as well, with having the specific regulator who has sort of tools and capabilities for addressing this space, because of the way that consumers behave online being so different from the way that consumers behave in the telecom space or even in the banking space. they multi-home here. There's interest in using multiple services for even the same particular data type. As a result, you have to have a little bit of intentionality about what you're building. You need to say, well, am I trying to encourage switching? Am I trying to encourage, innovation at the edge or in complementary services? And based on what model you're trying to build for, you might make different choices about the things that Michael raised, about which data type and whose data types should be included to enable that kind of either switching or multi-homing. So Facebook actually has done quite a bit of thinking about this, especially as it relates to sort of the uniqueness of data and as it relates to sort of data protection rules. And we put out a paper in September of last year, written by our Chief Privacy Officer for Policy, Erin Egan, which sort of lays out what we think are the sort of the places where these tensions between competition-oriented or innovation-oriented models of portability you see in the telecom space that you'd like to see applied in the digital space, where they butt into some of the tensions that exist in social networking and internet services. And so we laid out a few questions there. So what is data portability? What are you trying to achieve here? Are you trying to achieve this innovation at the edge? Are you trying to achieve substitutory, complementary switching? And then drawing from that, which data types should be included? And that goes to, like, is it the user's data, or is it the platform's data that's involved? When they provide something to us, a photo that they've uploaded, it's an obvious case that they should be able to support that. It's where it gets more interesting and more privacy sensitive when they include things like, when we potentially want to include things like inferences about how people behave online, whether we flag them as an integrity or a fraud threat on our platform, whether we flag them as a particular ads interest category. That's where things become a little bit more interesting, because it runs into sort of innovation challenges. How much are we going to, or less us, perhaps smaller providers, going to innovate when it comes to having to transfer the information that makes their platforms work and unique and special to themselves or to their users. And then there's the question that I think is most important for social networks: whose data? Everything you do on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or even Zoom at this point, it relates to other people. Who attended this Zoom call today? What information belongs to Tom as the host? What information belongs to us as panelists? And when Tom says, I want to take my information about the Zoom call to another service, to Google Meets or to Skype, God bless them, what goes with them? And that's a really challenging problem to solve, even at the most obvious case, when it comes to a screenshot of this chat, which includes information about all of us, about all of our homes, but really would belong to the person in the intellectual property sense, to the person who took the screenshot. In Facebook's terms, we might know that Jason and Catherine and Michael and Tom were all in this shot with me. How can we ensure that those people have an ability to ensure that their interests are vindicated before a transfer, and then their rights are vindicated if something should go wrong on the back end of a transfer, if that data is misused or goes to a destination they're not comfortable with. And then finally, you can envision it becoming much more complex as it goes beyond just provided information. We observe things about the connections between users. We infer things about the connections between users that we display to users. Jason, Catherine might be a person on Facebook. Would you like to friend her? Whose information is that to port? Should it be portable at all? It really, can achieve levels of complexity that I don't think the platforms were designed to cope with, and perhaps the data portability isn't really designed to address.
But a number of people have suggested that the only way data portability, at least in the social network area, can be meaningful is if you are able to port your entire identity, including your contacts. I guess it's called your social graph, and several economists have reported that that's the way to make it meaningful. And that's maybe
that's the switching cost we're getting at, right? That's the one that everyone is sort of dancing around.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly in a social network like Facebook. Yeah. Yeah.
I think some of these.
They're talking about something different than just taking your contacts, because I thought you could do that pretty easily now. I mean, you can take your address book with you.
Yeah.
The issue is, I think what happens, I understand like Josh Gann's proposal, these ones is what happens when you were on Facebook, you go somewhere else, and somebody on Facebook sends you a message on Facebook. And the question is, does it get forwarded to you? So it's not just taking your contacts, it's maintaining the functionality, which is, I think, gets into this question. It seems to me, interoperability is different than data portability, although the two, they clearly go together, because the question is what data are going to then go across these boundaries. So I could just come back, just add a few things on the interoperability, because I think Bijan really covered things on the portability side. But you have sort of this same issue, somewhat you were getting at, plain old telephone service is a stable service. You also had this thing that you had, it wasn't the service providers developing the equipment and the standards. I mean, they had a say in it, but they were all using the same equipment because you had this global scale of the equipment industry that was different than the scale of the providers. I think that's something that's different than what we see now. You have the service providers at a global scale or even industry scale. So it's not like there's a big ecosystem of third-party providers that have interests in standards, because any one of them is so small. You now have a handful of firms that are big enough that they, in some sense, like Microsoft used to say, we believe in industry standards, we set our own because we're the industry. You sort of, and I think that changes things in terms of incentives. But to come back, I think the big issue is, how much, and this comes up in a lot of things, how much by standardizing and having the open interfaces and ability to go across networks, are you limiting the ability of the networks to innovate? And the trick is always, can you get a baseline level of standardization and then allow innovation on top of that? So, I mean, presumably, you could see that with email, that we have enough standardization that email messages get exchanged across different service providers, but there clearly is also differentiation among email service providers in terms of the functionality they provide. So again, I think it's one of these things where it's all on a continuum. Baseline level of compatibility, interoperability, probably most companies are in favor of. It's what happens when you start layering things on top of that, or you start innovating. Do you then have to share your innovation? I think that's, again, where the real issues are going to lie.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with that, Michael. Of course, it goes both ways, which is if you lock in too much of a standard, you can deter innovation. But if you also have an open platform, you can bring new entrants in to innovate on top of that platform. I think that's a little bit, again, why you need to do it carefully on a case-by-case basis. But, an awful lot of innovation happens on top of standardized platforms. I think also all of this, intersects with other aspects of what you'd want for competition. So take something that has incredibly low switching costs, which is what your default browser is on your iPhone. It takes 2 seconds to go into the settings and change that from Google to something else. Almost no one does that. Google pays to be listed where they are, presumably because they think being the default matters. It's not just that people are making a de novo choice. There's a little bit of a switching cost that some of my own history and the like, if I switch over to DuckDuckGo, it won't, know the things about me Google knows, and my searches either will be worse as a result or less creepy and thus better as a result, depending on your tastes. But if you want to have things like when you get your device, you have a screen and you have to pick which search engine rather than having it default to one of them, that would work fine with search engines because I could go and search off of any one of them. It wouldn't work well with, messaging or the like, because the messaging doesn't work across all the different messaging systems. And so the more you can solve some of the mobility interoperability issues, the more you can, open up some choices and unbundle some parts of these products where they're unbundleable, and give consumers better choices and the like. So I think a lot of the different parts of the competitive agenda intersect, and the mobility and open standards are the one thing through all of them to go back, 8 topics ago, I think in our conversation here on data openness as a barrier to entry, I think that is a lot harder. And I think we had much less in the way of, concrete, here's what you should go off and do tomorrow, things to solve the data as a barrier to entry and data openness, and, so many issues around the value of the data, going away after 30 minutes for searches and the like. So I think that is, for me at least, a little bit more hand wavy at this moment. Not that it isn't worth waving one's hands quite vigorously, hoping something comes out of it and smarter people solve it. But I think the other ones, everything Bijan said, he was so incredibly smart and articulate about all of it that he didn't just raise problems, but I'm confident he can solve all the ones he raised.
If you have so much portability and interoperability that it doesn't make any difference what platform you're on, you can access all the features of any other platform. Isn't that a disincentive to try and introduce features for innovation, that introduce features to attract customers?
No, it's because you have your baseline level and then you innovate on top of that. I mean, Gmail.
What's the baseline?
Start with, you could search your emails more effectively, not, you could send or receive them differently than you could send or receive them for anyone else. So I think there's all sorts of ways you can channel your innovation.
Look, it seems to me on that, I mean, I agree with that. And I think one of the really important things you just said was, it really is going to have to be case by case, because there is this thing of lumping all these different digital platforms together, and there are some very different structures. But I think it's just going to be an ongoing process, because you could see having this basic thing of exchanging, one extreme sort of some basic message exchange, the other extreme is something that's sort of completely internal to the particular user, such as searching through your emails, which, so I know someone's saying, oh, you could actually do stuff making that social. But anyway, but there are going to be these middle grounds of what happens when an email service somehow starts exchanging certain kinds of messages. You can only, some advanced video, 3D video, something or other, that only goes among its users. And then you're going to get in this question, how is that something that says, oh, is that a innovation on top, or is that the new basic service? And I think the answer is almost certainly what's considered the basic service will evolve over time. And so this is not like we're going to do this once and say, oh, we got it right, we're done. There's just going to be this constant battle over sort of where the boundaries are. But I think it is a fight worth having to some degree. And I think it's all a question of, I think different people are going to have very different views on where the right place to draw the line is.
Let me get back to some of the implementation questions, but let me also ask Bijan. I mean, Facebook has proposed, has come out in favor of data portability, but I don't believe you've come out in favor of interoperability. Am I correct in that?
That's correct. I think partly because some of the things we raised in terms of challenges around data portability are just, significantly tougher, or perhaps happen at a much greater scale with interoperability. The data transfers and data portability are sort of intentional. They may happen on a regular basis or one at a time, but they require a user to sort of make the choice to move their data from one place to another. With interop, one, it depends on which service you're interoperating, and two, the data transfers that happen and the privacy risks that are less surface level, because the user is not really thinking about transferring data. They're really thinking about, I want this functionality to work across services. I want to talk to my friends from Facebook on Facebook Messenger, on GroupMe, or on Twitter DM. And as a result, that I think as a privacy practitioner, they're less aware of the data protection challenges that they might run into in using interoperable services. And I think there's also the question of whether users want that kind of interoperable service, depending on the service you're thinking about. So think about messaging. We talked a lot about multi-homing. There might be a particular reason that users want a multi-home that we haven't sort of teased out in messaging services, that they don't want those services to be interoperable, right? They might want a particular layer of them to be interoperable. iMessage and SMS or RCS need to be interoperable because they're on their phones, and they're the primary sort of, telecom associated or device associated messaging service. But perhaps they don't want, GroupMe and WhatsApp and Kik and these different services and to be directly interoperable because they talk to different audiences in different ways on those services. And I think there needs to be more exploration of that sort of user demand for interoperability that I don't think has, I mean, we sort of say, well, of course it's going to be beneficial, but is it? Do users truly want it? I don't think we've sort of explored that just yet.
Yeah. I'd just like to jump in because I think that's such an interesting point, because I think, a lot of this literature in economics is based on some canonical fax machine or the telephone network. And there, because you've got pipes, you've got physical equipment, there's a huge risk of everyone ending up single homing. But then suddenly in the digital world, we are in a world where we can multi-home, right, quite easily. I can get notifications from 8 different messaging services very easily on my phone. And I don't know if we've quite yet approached whether that multi-homing is a great thing or somehow, you've heard some conversation where there's a worry that it's a bad thing. As you were saying, right, if I'm using Snapchat purposely to have fleeting conversations, what does it mean to try and make those fleeting conversations interoperable with other services? So I just love that point. And, I'm always wanting Michael to speak because he's fought for so, he's the network effects god. So I want to sort of hear what he has to say.
Speak, Michael. I think.
I just said something really brilliant while on mute, but now I've forgotten it. No, I mean, actually, I'm not sure. I do have a lot to say on that other than, I think it keeps coming back to, well, some of the things, what goes into the baseline that you have where you have interoperability, and to what extent does that provide constraints on the development of additional features or not? And again, it's all going to be really specific. And I think, Catherine, what you just brought up is there may be, in the case of Snapchat, you'd say, well, the specific feature is what our service is. And if you're forcing us to be interoperable, you're basically saying we have to give away our core IP and, source of product differentiation. So I think that is an example where where people say, no, that's not what we mean by the basic functionality. And again, I think it's also an area where people are going to really disagree, because we already see this, right? This whole question, I think you talk to people, you say, to what extent do you want to have strong IP protection because you think that's what pushes innovation and investment? And then the other side, you say, no, we want openness because that's what allows the most people to innovate, and they'll come up with some way to appropriate the benefits of their innovation. And this is something we see economy-wide, different views, and that debate's just going to continue here.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the, we have a little bit of time left and I don't see any questions. Let's talk about what's required to implement some of these things, particularly, I think both portability and maybe even more so interoperability. So the Access Act requires interoperable interfaces based on, quote, fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory, basically FRAND terms, which presumably includes rates platforms would charge each other for exchanging data and other services. The FRAND concept, certainly there's lots of disputes about what FRAND is in the patent world, in the standard essential patent world. Is that something we want to import into this world?
I would just, I'm sure everyone else has other stuff to say, but I'll just offer the observation that the FRAND world has been so litigated around, subject to so much controversy. The idea of trying to impose that into, say, messaging, where what is a message and what is important in a message changes every year. I just worry that it may be more counterproductive than productive. But I'd like to go, that's just my initial off-the-cuff reaction.
Well, I also would say something else about friend, which is it's a fraught concept, but I think conceptually, though, I think there would be an agreement among a lot of people that when we're talking about with patents and stuff, we often mean it comes up right when we talk about standard essential patents. And then people ask the hypothetical where you say, well, look, it could have been that there were several different technologies that were substitutes. We picked one for the standard. Once we picked it, it now has a special role and a lot of market power. But to do friend, we can say, well, let's look at the hypothetical. So what if we had set the price before we had picked which one was the winner? And then so you then ask, okay, were there a bunch of substitutes or not? And there were, then you think the fair price would be quite low. Anyway, there's a hypothetical you can ask because you have this discrete act of picking something as the standard. It seems like here we're talking about something really different because you're saying to a platform, okay, you're really successful and now people want to interoperate with you. What's a fair price? And there's certainly an argument. He said, well, the monopoly price is the fair price because we've achieved our monopoly legitimately, fair and square under the US antitrust laws or whatever country you're in. And so we should be able to charge whatever price we want. It's just, it seems to me, you don't have this sort of defining event the way we have in IP. And even with IP or standard essential patents, it's been a mess. It seems like it's going to be even more of a mess here.
I mean, I just think it's such an important point that when we think about the vision of friend, there's some idea of a forward-looking world where we know we're going to make a standard into some kind of hardware and we need to protect that world. And it just seems so different, as you eloquently explained, from this world.
Right.
I think they're also, in the Access Act, and I'm maybe doing a little bit of wish casting here, trying to, I think, point at not just these questions around, rate setting and price, but whether the terms you offer, because, if you're offering API access, you're offering a particular set of terms for that access, how often you can access the API, what data you can take, under what you can do with that data, that there isn't sort of a sort of pretextual set of criteria that essentially prevent people from having access to that API for anti-competitive reasons. I think that's sort of, in some of the application of FRAND thinking to API access, they're really going at the non-discriminatory piece, which is, that anybody can have access to it, and that you're not using, well, this person is likely to be a bad data protection candidate, or this person, this entity has a long history of run-ins with the FTC. We ought not to enable interoperability with them because they have this bad background. If you have those criteria, they need to be fair and non-reasonable and non-discriminatory, and not anti-competitive, I think is what they're really trying to hit at.
You have a question from Bill Lair. In talking about platforms, it is easy to forget that most of the key players, Facebook, Google, Apple, etc., operate multiple ecosystems of platforms. How does data portability address those multi-layer issues? What issue for interoperability and portability when layered architecture is evolving and far from clear?
I mean, I think this raises complexities, but also is a big part of the motivation for why you want it, because you want to be able to have, portability across platforms, and I mean across companies. And when companies are operating multiple platforms or ecosystems of platforms or whatever you want to call it, it can allow them to leverage in one area their power into market power in another area. And so leveling that playing field by letting you combine and mix and match across the big companies, or across other companies, smaller ones that don't yet exist. So I think this certainly raises the complexity, but also this question, but also raises the importance of the whole enterprise.
Can I say it also raises something that sometimes comes up where privacy regulation is working against competition. And that is to the extent you start having privacy regulation that says you can have data transfers within a firm, but you have to be really careful going across the boundaries, then it creates just the sort of problem that Jason was worrying about, right? And that you have these the network, as long as they stay within the company, they can share things and offer benefits, but then you can't go across. And so sometimes the problem, and sometimes maybe the firms are trying to do this to get competitive advantage, but sometimes I think it's actually driven by public policy coming from the privacy area.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we have some unique experience with this in the last couple of years. If you've taken a look at our FTC consent order, it really does involve a great deal of oversight, restriction, and vetting around our platform ecosystem, which was really designed around enabling some of these very same kinds of data transfers and interoperable services, or at least integrated services between Facebook's platform and other parties. And it really has led to a sort of a narrowing of the breadth of the ecosystem and the amount of data sharing that can happen. And I think it's a perfect example of that tension. And then actually, if you look at the FTC consent order, there's a specific carve out for, well, data portability is different. We don't know how it's different or why it's different, and perhaps they'll address that. And this is a plug for their FTC workshop in September. But it's different than the requirements we've imposed on you as part of this order. And so make sure that you think it's different and behave differently in portability.
So we have another question from Mark McCarthy. Should there be a single regulator to handle the privacy conflicts with competition policy? Anybody want to take that?
I mean, the FTC would suggest that they are the single regulator to address data protection or consumer protection issues and
That's right.
Issues.
Let me ask you.
I just think, first of all, I think there's an awful lot that's congruent between them. I think when consumers value their privacy, competition gives them more options on privacy and drives innovation in privacy. We certainly benefit from the fact that there are two mobile operating systems, and one of them advertises more heavily on privacy than the other. That gives a choice. So I think there's some congruence. I think it probably depends from country to country. The UK and most European countries have a dedicated privacy regulator. It's not going to do competition, and it probably isn't going, and vice versa. The competition authority isn't going to do privacy. So you need to make sure that there's additional mandates and goals for the different regulators if there's different ones. And I think that should work perfectly fine, given that there is a certain amount of congruence and complementarity of the two policy goals.
Yes, I guess I'm less convinced it will work fine, because I think there are more tensions between privacy and competition. You might think so. First off, I think, as I already mentioned, the one example that sort of privacy regulation can have adverse effects on competition. And also, I think it's not so clear that more competition is better. Of course, it depends what we mean by more competition is better for privacy. Now, clearly, if you're saying consumers having a menu of choices of levels of privacy, I agree that's a good thing, but it's not clear that that's what you'll necessarily get. I mean, certainly if you get into intensely competitive markets, you can basically get to the point where the only way to survive is to lie to customers about your privacy. And that actually competition can create more incentives for bad behavior. So I think actually just have to be careful, though. I think there is a lot to be said for trying to have at least some sort of coordination between privacy and competition. Well, whether it's one agency, I'm not sure, but I do think there's some tensions there that need to be addressed.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I agree there are tensions, and so I agree they need to coordinate, have mandates that require them to do it. I just didn't want to leave standing the notion that they're two, opposite things, and that if you do one, you can't do the other. I think there's a
I would agree that they're not opposite. There are things, I would just say this, and it makes sounds like we do agree. There are places where they're potentially in tension with each other, and there are places where they reinforce each other. And so I think you and I can both agree it's good to coordinate these things.
Here we have another privacy-related question from Laura Martin. Does hacking risk rise as data sets are more transferable?
As the privacy lawyer on the call, I mean, I think that's sort of axiomatic. The additional attack surface, more data, more APIs, interoperability and data portability both lead to privacy challenges. I think they can be overcome with good design and sort of good incentive models and regulation, but it definitely, yes, does lead to additional risk.
Okay, well, let me just ask one question, because Jason brought up the two mobile operating systems, and we have an example, I guess, that's just coming out as we speak of interoperability. I guess it's an example of interoperability. The Apple Google COVID contact tracing app, or making those two systems interoperable as far as that's concerned. Is that going to I mean, aside from the direct issue of that particular direct issue, is that going to move interoperability forward in a more general sense? Or?
Around pandemics.
Hopefully that's not the everyday occurrence, but
yeah, it feels very sui generis to me, but I don't know.
Right. Well, listen, we have reached the end of our hour, and I want to thank everybody for a great discussion. I think this recording will be available on our website and in due course. And thank you all again very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.